Chronic racial and social injustice leaves a traumatic imprint on the mind and the body and the spirit. On this episode of Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene, noted neuroscientist Dr. Peter Sterling tells us why this happens and what it means for our evolution. This episode originally aired August 25th, 2021.
Again, another week. Thank you for joining us on Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene. Race Talk Revolution is where your voice matters. And I want to again thank you for joining us this afternoon and this morning. So our topic today is neuroscience and the chronic disease of social injustice. Neuroscience and the chronic disease of social justice. Our guest is noted neuroscientist and cultural anthropologist, Dr. Peter Sterling, and you will be meeting Dr. Sterling in just a moment. As always, our conversation today, and during our conversation today, we ask that you please remain muted for all of those who are new today. And when we get to the Q&A section, we will instruct you on how to raise your hand and how that whole thing works. We also want to remind you that Race Talk is a loving, respectful, and inclusive platform, and it is designed to encourage constructive dialogue around tough issues pertaining to racial and social injustice. Race Talk Revolution is a safe space for people of all backgrounds to share ideas and opinions, explore the nuances of systemic racism, and to grow our anti-racism muscles. In our Race Talk community, we practice radically inclusive love. So even if we don't understand or agree with what's being shared, we listen with respect, appreciation, and empathy. You see, it is our commitment that every person be encouraged, heard, and appreciated, because on Race Talk Revolution with Lane and Eugene, every voice matters. And my co-host, the Reverend Lane Cobb.
Good afternoon, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Race Talk Revolution. Yay! So I'm in love with our guest this morning. He is a lifelong political activist, an American anatomist, physiologist, and neuroscientist, and professor of neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, Dr. Peter Sterling. He is also the author of What is Health, Allostasis, and the Evolution of Human Design. And that is a brand new book, just came out last year. And that book raises the provocative question, what does our species require for a healthy life? And I'm going to be putting the link to that book in the chat at the end of our presentation this afternoon. Dr. Sterling is known for his public criticisms of harmful psychiatric treatments in the 1970s, including electroshock and antipsychotics, and his research on the connection between social injustice and chronic systemic disease. As a college student in the 1960s, Dr. Sterling was a member of the historic civil rights protest group, the Freedom Riders. Dr. Sterling could also be described as an ethnographer, as his travels among the indigenous people of Panama, where he now lives part-time, influenced his understanding of how the human brain was shaped in response to the demands of early hunter-gatherer societies. So Dr. Sterling, welcome. Thank you so much for making time to be with us this afternoon. So glad to have you. And when we met last week, I asked you if there was a relationship between neuroscience and cultural anthropology. And you replied that the fields weren't really related. But you also went on to say that they have come together for you to form the basis of your discoveries about health. And I'm wondering if you might start there.
Sure. Well, first, Lane and Eugene, thank you for inviting me. This is looks like a wonderful group, and I'm very glad to meet you all. Cultural anthropologists would not consider me a cultural anthropologist. I don't have a degree in that, and I never even took a course in it. But over 40 years or so, I have traveled in indigenous communities, and the community that we live in now in Panama is out in the country in the Campo. It's among basically subsistence farmers, and a lot of the agricultural laborers there are indigenous people, the Nobe indigenous group in Panama. Panama has about 6 different distinct indigenous groups, and we've visited them all at various times. And so it's always interested me how other people live. And so when I studied neuroscience, I was sort of always informed by what the people I was visiting and who I was working with, and wondering how that played into our brains and the development of our culture. And basically, I started out, I was raised in a family of communists. Basically, they were members of the American Communist Party. It shocks some people today who don't realize that the people in the 30s, 40s, and up into the 50s in America who were communists were basically not concerned with world revolution and overthrowing governments. They were concerned with racial improvement of the racial situation in the US, and forming unions, racial and economic justice, basically. And that's how I was raised. And so when I was 20, the Freedom Rides were an opportunity to by converging on Jackson, Mississippi, on buses and trains, to force the federal government to make a clear ruling about no more segregation on interstate travel. And that was so that was an opportunity for me to join in and to see how successful that sort of action, direct action, could be. And basically, I've continued that throughout my life. And for a long time, there was a sort of a disconnect between that life of going into direct action and civil rights. I studied in Cleveland, Ohio, for my PhD, and I was involved in Congress of Racial Equality activities there, demonstrations, writing, doing research, and so on. But there was a split between my activities outside of the lab, in the street, basically, and what I was doing in the laboratory. And so it took me a long time. There was a conflict for me, and it took me a long time to figure out how to put those two themes of my life together. And so what I'm talking to you today is the sort of close to the end point, I would say, of my efforts to integrate those two activities.
Terrific. Thank you. As I say, great work. I find the question about what our species requires for a healthy life quite fascinating, just because many of us are not meeting our requirements clearly. And that really says something about our society, but I want to allow you to talk about the connection between chronic oppression and disease. So I know those two things are connected. So let's just talk about all of that, if you don't mind. What have you seen between the connection between chronic oppression and disease, and what our species requires to live a healthy life?
Sure. Well, maybe the first thing to do, and if I forget stuff, you just remind me. But I think the first thing is basically to mention what I discovered for myself in the first place. And that was when I left my microscope in the laboratory in Cleveland, Ohio, to go into the Black community there, was a ghetto, because in Cleveland at that time, and still, Black people were concentrated in two major ghettos, Central and Huff, which were very close to each other. And there were hardly a single Black family could live outside of those ghettos at that time. And it's still pretty segregated. So, which you can you can Google the census tracts now in a flick of a keystroke and see this for yourself. So I would go canvassing in Central and knocking on doors. I was tutoring in Huff for a while. And people would come to the door, see what this young kid, I was 24 maybe, wanted. And many of the people who would come to the door were half paralyzed. They would be limping, their face would be sagging, their speech would be slurred. And I'd never seen this, in the white middle-class community where I grew up. When I went back to the lab, my thesis supervisor was actually a neurologist. He said, "Oh yeah, that's a stroke. That's a hemiplegia. That's what happens when you get a stroke." And I was studying actually the cortical connections. That's the destruction of the cortical pathways to the motor neurons that run the facial muscles and the body. And so I wondered, well, why are they getting strokes? Well, that is very often a consequence of chronic hypertension. And if you look in the medical books, why do people have hypertension? They say, well, it's called essential hypertension. We don't really know the cause, And why do Black people have more? Well, maybe bad genes, they eat too much salt, and so on. So that was the explanation, very little explanation, but what it was focused on the body, something wrong with it. And last year, just when I finished writing my book, I thought, well, I better look up and see what the medical textbooks say about it now, 50 years later, 60 years later. And they say the same thing, okay? They still deny that we understand the causes of hypertension. So I was thinking about it, and I realized, I didn't grow up in Cleveland, but my father did. My grandfather was a house painter. He was an immigrant and Jewish. And at that time, Central was a Jewish ghetto before it was a Black ghetto. And so he was segregated in this ghetto. He was a member of the Jewish House Painters Union because the Christian one didn't accept Jews. And in fact, so he had suffered the same sort of social tension that any group does when they're living in a ghetto, confined to a ghetto. And he also had hypertension, and he had an early stroke in his early 60s. So I realized that, maybe hypertension is related to social tension. When I got to Philadelphia to take my first and only job at the University of Pennsylvania, I began to slip away from my microscope as I had as a graduate student. But this time I went to the library and I started reading to see if I could understand what the evidence was that might connect the brain. I mean, if social tension is going to cause hypertension, it has to do so through the brain somehow. And so what are the brain connections to those parts of the body that cause high blood pressure? And those include the physical causes of raising the blood pressure are one, the kidney, whose job it is to pump enough salt water into the vascular system to hold the pressure, and then to discard a certain amount of salt water or retain a certain amount according to what pressure is needed over hours or days or months. And the heart, and how hard the heart pumps and how fast it pumps, and the blood vessels and how open they are, which lowers the pressure, or how constricted they are to raise the pressure. And so when your attention is drawn to something and your brain thinks, oh, you need to raise the pressure, it controls the kidney, the heart, and the blood vessels in a coordinated way to raise the pressure or to lower it. And so, so what I found was, and this was really, most of the discussion in medicine was about how the kidney regulates itself, how the heart regulates itself, and how vessels regulate themselves. But I found, gosh, every single arterial vessel in the body is covered with nerve endings, so the brain is controlling that. And then I found the amazing thing is that there are nerve endings controlled by the brain on hormonal cells in the kidney. And that's the hormone that causes the kidney to increase the amount of salt water in the blood. And then, of course, the heart, we know, has nerves. So I realized probably by early 70s that the brain really had all the access to control blood pressure that it could need. And then I continued to gather the evidence as it appeared in the literature that, in fact, African Americans have high blood pressure, but in the Caribbean, the same people, same genetic stock don't have it, and it's lower. And in West Africa, where African Americans came from, who are living in simple societies, they don't have high blood pressure. And I discovered, living in Panama, visiting these indigenous communities, they don't have high blood pressure, they don't have cardiovascular disease. And so I satisfied myself that this really, the reason African Americans suffer so much hypertension, and then of course the other aspects of type 2 diabetes and so on, is basically because in America, Black lives still don't matter. And so one of the things we need to have a healthy life is we have to feel that our lives matter. And so, that's a shortish answer. Why don't I stop there?
Well, I was telling you earlier, I could talk about this stuff all day. And really, I mean, this is a lot of stuff. But viscerally, we can understand that, right? We understand that chronic oppression puts us in a state of chronic fight or flight. We understand the pressure that puts on our bodily systems. It's interesting how you just also talked about, kidney disease and heart disease and, hypertension, all of these things, and everything is connected. One of the things that you've criticized the medical field for is not addressing or giving the brain credit, not really addressing how much the brain is connected to chronic disease. And I know that you are educating your students about that. Say a little bit about that, if you would, sir, please.
Yeah, well, so I, having figured some of this stuff out for myself, I began writing papers pointing out that I called the first paper I wrote with a colleague of mine, then a young man he was a couple of years younger than I, a brilliant guy named Joseph Iyer, and we worked on this stuff together. In fact, he sort of got me into reading about other ethnographic studies. And the first paper I wrote with him was called "The Biological Basis of Stress-Related Mortality," and where we just listed, and this came out finally in 1981, and I listed all of the scientific papers that documented the neural connections from the brain to all of these other organs that would cause stress-related mortality. And I began to teach. I taught a seminar course for medical students called Stress, and I had some difficulty actually getting permission to teach that course because the faculty committee wanted to know, well, why don't you have most medical courses are team taught by 10 people who come in and give lectures. Why do you want to do this personally? I said, well, I think this is about integrating our understanding, and if one person can't integrate it, then how are you going to expect medical students to integrate it? So I sort of got grudging permission to do it, and then I had an opportunity to give 3 lectures in a sequence in our course in neuroscience about stress-related mortality, when we were discussing those parts of the brain that are concerned with emotion and appetites and stuff like that. And so I would give these lectures. And at that time, I thought, well, if this is about emotion, I think we should actually stir up some emotion. So I chose some music to play in these lectures. And I chose particularly some music of a woman singer, poet at the time named Dori Previn, and her work is on YouTube, you can see it, and they're just overwhelmingly powerful songs. And I played them, and each time I played, they were 2 minutes or something. I played one in each lecture, two in each lecture, because I knew that people would say, "Oh, why are you wasting our time?" But it was only 2 minutes. But when the music would stop, I mean, I could hardly talk. They're so powerful. And the students, what I found was about a third of the class would think, "Oh my God, yeah, this is what we came for." About a third of the class was sort of indifferent, and a third of the class walked out. They just couldn't tolerate this level of emotional intensity. And so I think I did discover pretty early that you can't expect everybody to respond to these issues. But so I managed to try to maintain somewhat of a following, but it was never huge. And so when I actually published this book in 2020, I was hoping, yeah, this will should be read by medical students, but I'm finding it quite hard to get attention for it. And each week I go into Amazon to see, has anybody bought my book this week? And no, I mean, it's not going that well, I would say. So I'm glad to have an audience to keep plugging it. So basically, one has to keep making the point that the way we feel, the way we treat each other, has everything to do with health, and without that, there's really relying on drugs. That's the other thing is that's happened in 40, 50 years, is that the drug companies have taken over, and now they drive medicine really. And so if you have hypertension or any sort of cardiac disease, you're taking not just one drug, you're taking a whole family of drugs. And the problem is, once you give up the brain's chance to regulate your body, and you start regulating your kidney with a diuretic, and your heart with a so-called beta blocker, and your blood pressure with another set of drugs, your blood vessels with calcium blockers, then you can lower your blood pressure, but then it's hard to take a walk. And I walk with men my age, I'm 81 now, and many of them are on 5 or 6 drugs. And when we come to a gentle slope, they have to stop. So the problem is that, and I call this polypharmacy, taking many drugs, is treating your disease with multiple drugs. And you can keep people alive for quite a long time, but it's not what I would call health. It's a really limited range of activities that you can do. And so, the more you can take back your body, take back your brain by various activities, the better, the healthier you can have real health by doing that. And I guess, what are the best things to do? Well, one is you got to get exercise. People in the United States do not have nearly enough exercise. In hunter-gatherer societies, people walked, 8 hours a day. They were in tremendous physical condition, and that's the way we evolved as human beings. And so If you want health, you have to do that. And I think my other experience now is in aging is to get enough sleep. I don't use an alarm clock. I mean, my sleep isn't perfect, but I start getting ready for bed, at 8:15 because it takes a while, and I have to deal with my teeth, and that takes quite a while. I do some exercises before I go to bed, and so I think that people have to log, and if you exercise, you sleep better, and if you sleep better, you can exercise. And I think this really does improve your mind and keep it going for a lot longer than it would without those two critical things.
Well, let's take it back if we can to the oppression, because we have people. Yeah, we have people in the chat who are asking some really great questions, and one of the things that you talk about is deaths of despair, and that this is not a phenomenon that is limited to the communities of color. This is, impoverished communities. These are people who live, as someone said, in food deserts and where there's no, lack of access to medical care, et cetera, not good jobs. So perhaps you can talk about that a little bit. And then people are wanting to find out also about food choices. But let's talk about the deaths of despair and where we see this.
Sure. The National Academy of Sciences just put out a report in March, and it's published fully I think in June. And I've written a long commentary on it, which I can share with anybody who's interested. And I'm trying to get it published, but this is always a difficult matter. The report by sociologists and demographers and epidemiologists says there's a health crisis in the US now, and that US adults are dying at rising rates. They're dying at far higher rates than 16 nations, comparison nations, which includes Western Europe and Canada, Australia, and Japan. And the reason, the causes of death, we're excluding COVID as an issue now, are deaths from drug overdose, alcoholism, alcohol, and all of the various slower deaths by various addictions, and also a large component of obesity, which from overeating. And I consider that rich food is something that people eat to excess in a similar way that they take various drugs and alcohol, because it does the same thing. It releases the chemical dopamine in the brain, which makes us temporarily feel better. So all of these activities, all of these addictions really are to release enough dopamine to make us feel okay. And the thing is that in simpler lives and simpler societies, we had our daily activities, finding a little bit of food, finding a little bit of comfort. Any positive surprise during your day would release a little pulse of dopamine and make you feel okay. You could stop and rest. You got a dry cave, a warm fire, a bite of rabbit, something, you'd feel okay. Now, everything that we need for minimal comfort in food is sort of expected. It's anticipated, so it doesn't release, it doesn't give us this dopamine. And people need this every day, some little set of positive surprises. And if they can't get it, they go hunting for these other things that will do it. So the deaths of despair right now, I mean, for hundreds of years, death rates in the African-American community were far, far higher than for whites. But over the last 30 years, conditions of life have improved in the Black community, and their death rates have been coming down. Meanwhile, the death rates for poor whites and whites with least education, no education beyond high school or even less, have been rising. And they're rising also more in rural areas than in the city, which is, again, a reversal of the pattern of a long time. It used to be high death rates in the city, and now it's high in the rural areas. And these are the people who are dying of, of heroin and methamphetamine and all these other drugs, and who are dying of overeating, basically, and alcohol. And these have been called, the term deaths of despair was coined by two professors at Princeton, Angus Deaton and Ann Case. Deaton was a Nobel Prize winner. And so this is now recognized by the National Academy as a health crisis. And what does this National Academy Committee propose to do about it? Well, they propose, we need better needle exchanges. We need to teach resilience, make people tougher. We need to support recovery programs. We need to teach children, not to do this. We need to distribute Narcan all over the country. There in Philadelphia, somebody sent me a sign. There's at the bus stop, there's signs for Narcan. But is it what they don't do in this report is say, well, why aren't they dying in Europe and Japan? What is going on? Well, what are the differences? And I can tell you what they are. They all concern, the main differences for all of these 16 nations have to do with the various difficult parts of the human life cycle. Our species needs help at each stage of the life cycle. And I'll go through it with you. Is that okay? Can I walk through this?
Sure, we can take a couple of minutes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So look, we have this huge brain. It's not mature at birth, and from birth onward, the brain grows, uses 60% of our energy as infants and young children. And so our body doesn't grow very fast. And only when the brain is sort of halfway there, 3/4 of the way there, then around adolescence, hormones to grow the body kick in. And so by age 20, you have a beginning to be mature brain and body. But human beings never took care of, they didn't feed themselves until age 20, and they still don't in simpler societies, foraging societies. They don't do anything until about age 20, and then they go out and help their parents and grandparents, and they learn from that. And the grandparents, of course, help out. For the parents to take care of these kids, for one kid for 20 years is a major problem. They couldn't have two kids if they were spaced too closely. So by the grandparents helping out 2 generations, we can have a reasonable population growth. So now in the U.S., there's no help for prenatal care. There's no help for maternal care. There's no paid maternity leave. There used to be 2 generations taking care of the children. Now then after World War II, maybe we're back to 1, and now 25% of children in the US grow up in single parent households. So this is all very difficult. Then there are no paid vacations, there's no paid medical care. And so what happens is that people in the poorest, least educated segments of the population are left to struggle with all of these issues on their own, and they can't manage. It's too difficult. And when life becomes too difficult and you can't see your way out you can't see a path forward, that's when people either actually kill themselves deliberately or they do it slowly by these various addictions. Okay, in these other countries, all of these things have been solved. That there is paid by taxes, prenatal care, maternal care, preschool care, and paid vacations, paid maternity leave, and all of these difficult stages, and the rate of single parent households is much lower, and where they are, they're helped out by the community. And so I think the reason for these deaths of despair are that people can't just see that they can't manage, and they can't see a way that they ever will, and they can't bear it. So I think that is a major issue. And the National Academy of Sciences was unwilling to really look at this in a serious way. Scientists are supposed to, they have an experimental group and a control group. Here are the National Academy of Sciences. They have the experimental group, the US, they have a control group, but they didn't look at the control group to explain to what's going on. And so that's what I'm trying to do now.
Goodness, thank you. Yeah, so because what we know happens is just a lot of finger pointing and victim blaming. Of course, it's a shortcoming. It's a genetic predisposition.
Yeah.
It's all these things.
Right.
So we might open it up to questions early. I don't know what you think, Eugene, but I know that Arnold asked a question. Who needs to know about your work? And I think he wants to know how we can help you get your work out there a little bit.
Well, it's not, I mean, it's the message, you know. The message has to change. People have to understand. I'm hoping that people in general will pay attention to some of the science that I'm talking about, because you have to know a little bit of science to say these drugs are not going to work. I mean, they do individually, they're brilliant. You know, the science underlying them is brilliant, but as a way of life, you know, it's not going to work, and it's not working. And so I'm hoping that people in the communities will begin to notice this and say it. I'm still looking for venues to get my message to the medical community and other scientists. And I tweet and I Twitter and I give lectures. I'm speaking at Cornell University next month, Yale next month. But it's very slow. So people in the community, you know, need to start studying some of this stuff and talking about it. You know, the book. I'll show it. This is the book. What is health? And the cover I really like. These are cave painting. This is a cave painting by indigenous people who walked from Alaska down to the tip of southern Argentina about 9,000 years ago. And the first thing they did was to find this cave and paint those hands. It's called there La Cueva de las Manos. People, and the point is that people with the beginning of our species had art, they had music, they had a culture, and that's what we need to have. People need to be participating in a culture and not just sitting around, you know, eating pills.
Great. Ooh, yeah. Good stuff. Yeah, let's go ahead and open up the Q&A. Frank, I see your hand up, and there are a couple of people ahead of you. I want to ask a question that was in the chat, and I don't see her hand is up, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it because it's a pretty powerful question. Let me see if I can get back to it. Oh, come on, where did it go? Hang on, please. There it is. So one of the people on the Race Talk here, I'm not going to give her name because she hasn't given me permission on that yet, because I think this is important. How does your theory on how does your theory see psychoactive meds? I'm on med for HDD and HDHD. Will that keep my brain from being able to regulate my system?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a little piece that I've written. I follow, there's a journal called Mad in America. It's a weekly thing. It's a very good, operated by a guy named Robert Whitaker. And I recommend this, this madinamerica.com. It's all one word. And I have a piece in that about my own ADHD day, my own morning. And let's see if I can find it myself. Yeah, it's called, my piece is called Attention, One Morning with a Roving Mind, okay? And, ADHD has your mind moving from different things, and it also has the component of being impulsive. And that's something that I also have. My decision to go to join the Freedom Rides was in a moment. Somebody said, "Who's going?" I raised my hand. I didn't think about I might get killed. I just did it, and I've done that, quite a bit. And I think, many people, if you stop and think too much, you're likely maybe not to do something that's a little bit maybe important. So I don't believe there is. So ADHD and many other psychiatric diagnoses, I believe, are basically nonsense. This is not a disease. It's not a mental disorder. Many of the great figures in world history were impulsive, and many of them had attention that basically the question about attention is everybody's paying attention. It's whether are you paying attention to the teacher or the boss, or are you paying attention to what's in your head? And I think that we have to support people who are paying attention to what's in their head. And that's what human beings really are about. So I observed that my son, who's now 50, he was in trouble in school. He wasn't paying attention to the teacher, but he was always paying attention to his own drawings, his own music, his own dramas that he was creating. And sometimes he would say, well, I think I need, to this day, he says, I think I need a Ritalin or Adderall to pay attention. I say, no, your success really depends on what's in your own head, not on somebody else's. So people differ on this spectrum. My wife is a scientist as well. And I would come home at dinner time and I'd say, oh, so-and-so gave this great talk in the seminar today. And she'd say, oh, really? What did he say? And I would say, well, he started off with this wonderful resonant voice, and he did this great introduction of what his broad goal is. And she said, yeah, but what did he say? What's the content? And I'd say, well, and then I started thinking about what I was going to make for dinner, and then I would kick in a little later, and I would hear a fragment of it and so on. But I don't take in a whole lecture in a gulp. Some people do. And I was never the person who could catch the teacher's dropped minus signs or plus signs and stuff like that. But at the end, I could have an overall concept of what was going on. So there are very many kinds of traits that we have. And I think that in communities, in a small community, what you want is to have each person with a slightly different trait. A skill to be a pathfinder or a tool builder or a spiritual leader, and somebody who would taste new plants. And so we needed all of these qualities, and that's the way one brain could not encompass all of these traits. But now we pathologize them. Somebody who has a little too much energy is called bipolar. Somebody who isn't paying attention to what the authority is saying is ADHD. So I really don't believe that these are diseases, although it's true with any trait. I mean, height. Some people are 7'6", they're way, way out on the tail of height. They're not normal. Normal means average. They're not normal, but they're not diseased either. They play basketball, you know. And so we've come to regulate all of these different slight differences from the mean with a bunch of drugs. And the drugs really, I mean, I know as much about the brain as anybody, and these drugs are not targeted to fix anything particular, and they don't. What they do is just like the hypertension drugs, is that they constrict your ability to function, basically.
Speaking of that real fast, so but going back to her question, is the medication that she's taking, will that have an effect on her system?
Sorry, I missed that. Say it again.
The medication that she is taking for the ADHD, will it affect how her system works?
Sure. I mean, it's look, all of the ADHD drugs are not mysterious. They are drugs that prolong the existence of dopamine in your at the synapses in your brain, and these include these operate by the same mechanisms as, for example, cocaine and amphetamines. Those all block the so-called dopamine reuptake transporters. And so what they give in school are Ritalin or Adderall and stuff like that. And they have the same mechanism of action as cocaine, you know. And so some people actually crush them up and snort them to get high. So yeah, they affect this dopamine system, and it's very much so. So we're telling, on one hand, kids, don't take cocaine, don't take speed, but we're giving them the same. It's essentially the same drug, you know, and it's crazy.
Yeah. All righty. So let's move on to the oops, wrong button here. Let's move on to some. We have a few people in the queue here. We have, starting with Adine, Colleen, and then Frank. But real fast, for those of you who are new to Grace Talk, if you want to raise your hand, you want to take your cursor down to the bottom of the page where all of this stuff is highlighted. Go over to the right side where it says reactions. Click on reactions, then you'll see the button that says raise hand. And if you can't find it there, then go to participants, click on that, find your name, and then on the right-hand side of your name, there are the epsilons, the 3 dots. Click on that, and you should find it there. If all else fails, just raise your hand. All right, yeah, but let's try those two first.
While, though, you know, like
yeah. All right, so we have Adine, Colleen, and then Frank.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sterling, thank you so much. This is totally fascinating. I have 3 points, and Eugene, I promise to make them rapidly. I did write in the chat that as African Americans, realizing what we are, the hostility we are surrounded by, we need to be more proactive about protecting ourselves. It doesn't surprise me that emotionally we are in less better shape than our Caribbean brothers and sisters who have not had quite as much vitriol in their lives. White domination here demands that we know that we are despised and barely human. And this has played into the health disparities and the health problems. The last thing I wanted to say was, I'm not surprised that you're getting resistance from the medical community, which is primarily dominated by white males. They do not want to admit their culpability in this problem, and they are capitalistic in their outlook, and therefore it would serve them no purpose to create a better, more caring society.
Yeah.
I'm through.
Yeah, that's quite true. Yeah. Colleen.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Dr. Sterling. I do want to correct one bit of information. I'm from Barbados in the West Indies, and Barbados, along with several other West Indian islands have tremendous rates of high blood pressure and diabetes. In fact, Barbados is considered the amputation capital of the world. So we're not much better off than our sisters and brothers. In fact, one of our scholars has said that he thinks people in the West Indies have been genetically modified because of the diets that the slaves were served, the high salt diets when there were slaves brought over from Africa. But be that as it may, I'm just curious as to what you would recommend for somebody who has hypertension, who's been on blood pressure medications for many years. Exercise alone doesn't seem to do the trick. And then my last thing that I want to ask you about is if you've heard of the concept called weathering that Black people suffer in this country.
Weathering, no, I don't know that.
Okay, it's related to the allostatic load.
Yes, okay. Yeah,
and the stress and the cortisol levels that cause us to end up with some of these chronic diseases like high blood pressure, diabetes, etc.
Sure. Okay, let me start off. Thank you for the comment on Barbados. And I didn't mean to suggest that there's no hypertension in the Caribbean, but the studies that I'm familiar with comparing those levels there to US Blacks show a difference. The argument being that it's the same genetic stock, but a difference could not be accounted for by genes. So I take your point. And diabetes is now definitely a world epidemic, and it goes very much with obesity. And people who are lean and exercising are not getting diabetes. So that is an issue of, that you have to ask what's going on in Barbados now, and I don't know enough about to comment on. But the question is, okay, you have hypertension. What do you do? I mean, chronic hypertension. What do you do? And the first thing I would say is that hypertension being caused by the brain, having learned, the brain learns certain things and then it creates certain patterns. And some things are hard to unlearn. It's hard to unlearn how to ride a bicycle, for example. So once you have an established pattern, it's hard for various organs, the blood vessels, for example, hypertrophy in response to high pressure, and it's hard for them to unlearn and to go back to a more relaxed state, although it can happen. So, and also having learned deeply these patterns, emotional patterns and responses, they're hard to unlearn. So I would say, but then this question is, what are you going to do? And so I would say several things. One is that high blood pressure, chronic high blood pressure is lethal. And one way or another, it's going to get your heart, it's going to get your kidney, or it's going to give you a stroke. And you really want to have your pressure low. That's first of all, we have to reduce our pressure. The second point is how to do it is there's a strong relationship between being overweight and having high blood pressure. And so one thing that is difficult, but in some way under control, is to reduce weight and to exercise. And so both of those things go together. The more you exercise, the easier it becomes to control your appetite and so on. So those are two definite things, is to try to move toward being more lean and exercise. That said, if your pressure is still high and you can't bring it down, you should take these drugs. I'm opposed to these psychiatric drugs because I don't think that they are helpful in the long run. But the drugs to reduce blood pressure, if you can't do it any other way, are really essential to the last thing you want is a stroke, you know. So I'm not saying that you should not take these drugs are necessary if that's what you have to do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. My brother Frank.
Let me just say one more thing about that, is that they also are overprescribed. And so if a doctor prescribes you 4 drugs and you continue on your program and you spend more time in nature and you do all the healthy things, it's okay to experiment by dropping your dose and seeing how what happens with your blood pressure, and continually trying to press up against to minimize the amount of these drugs that you take. And since now it's pretty cheap to get a blood pressure monitor, you can follow your own blood pressure and see whether, you know, which drugs you can back off on. Sorry.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Thank you. Frank?
Dr. Sterling, question and then a statement. Is your research peer reviewed? And then I can understand why you're having any resistance to getting it peer reviewed, because let's face it, most of the medical research is funded by universities and pharmacies who want to get that dollar for the research. And unfortunately, it's a system that is funded to keep them in business. In many respects, we're talking about the mental diseases and the DSM, I believe the DSM-5 and all the quote psychiatric diseases. And I find that I find some of them are ludicrous and the way that they just keep labeling people. People have their own way of being, and we label the most dumbest things as a disease just to be for that particular field to be relevant.
Frank, is there a question?
So my question is has your research been peer reviewed yet?
Peer reviewed.
Oh yeah. I mean, sure. So my laboratory research was on brain structure and function and on the retina, and all of that was peer reviewed. But as I began to write up these articles about stress and biological basis of stress-related mortality, yeah, this has been reviewed in various journals. And gradually over the time, I started out in rather obscure journals and social science and medicine and so on. And gradually, there has been some respect for my point of view and my effort. And so, yeah, so last 2019, I published a review of the idea. I call this allostasis, and we don't need to get into the technical explanation, but that was a word I coined, and for many years I was criticized for making a new word about physiology, but now it's been published in Trends in Neurosciences and some of the top journals. And I was asked a few years ago to write an article for JAMA Psychiatry, which is a major psychiatric journal, comparing homeostasis and allostasis, 2 ideas of physiology and stuff like that, by the editor of JAMA Psychiatry. And he published my stuff. So yeah, it's I would say it's difficult, but I have a lot of respect for the scientific establishment, scientific method of doing peer review and battling it through. And yeah, so yeah, I'm satisfied with that process. It's some frustrating and tiring, but yeah, I'm satisfied with it.
Thank you. Norman, and then Ava.
How are you doing? I only have one question, and that's how is stress and high blood pressure related?
Okay, that's a good question. Maybe I should have started off with that just straightforward question. So what happens is that your brain anticipates all of the things that you might need. And to be efficient, it decides what you need in terms of food, water, salt, nutrition, safety, temperature, all of these physiological needs, anticipates what you're going to need. And what it tries to do is to regulate everything so that you'll get just what you need, just when you need it, just in time. And so, because the body can't store a ton of stuff, it can't store a ton of energy, it can't store many things. So it has to predict what you're going to need and get it to you. So when the brain predicts you're going to need to really be alert, and you're going to have to watch your back and watch what's happening, it alerts every cell in your body, basically. It tunes up your kidney and your heart and your blood vessels, and it does that just before you need it. So, I mean, for example, when you just get out of bed at night, you swing your feet over from your bed onto the floor, and before you stand up, the brain has to say, this guy is going to need blood to be pumped to his head. Otherwise, he'll faint when he stands. I'm about to order him to stand up, but I also have to anticipate raising the pressure to his head while I do it, because otherwise he'll fall over. So imagine this is happening with every motion, every minute of the day. The brain is predicting what you're going to need. So it's telling the kidney, pump in a little salt water, pump in, make the heart beat a little stronger, and constrict those vessels. What happens is, over time, just like lifting weights, when you lift weights, your muscles anticipate that they're going to be needing to be stronger, and so they make more muscle and they get stronger. So your arteries, over time, when the average pressure is high, instead of being 100, it's 160, the arteries muscles thicken, and then they need higher pressure just to get the blood through. And so all of your body learns to anticipate the stress and the demand for high cardiovascular supplies. So the brain gradually trains the body to anticipate this, and that's what causes the hypertension.
The reason I asked that question was because my stress level is barely perceptible, but I have high blood pressure.
Right. So the question is, you've accumulated a certain number of years of higher stress, and so now when you relax and you kick back, it's going to take your body a while to recognize that, and to relax. So this is but in hunter-gatherer and forager societies, blood pressure. So we're taught, medical students are taught, blood pressure rises with age. Well, in those societies, it doesn't. It's just flat. It's 100 over, 60 or 70, or 110 over 60 or 70 when you're a young person and when you're old. But that's because of a life lived at basically low stress. The end of a life of high stress, it's hard to retrain. It's hard to retrain your body.
Okay, thank you.
We have Eva, and then Tyrone, and then Kevin. Eva, you're on mute. Eva? Okay, so let's go to Tyrone, and then we'll go back to see if Eva's ready. Then
Hello,
after,
can you hear me? Okay.
Oh, there she is.
Okay, thank you. Doctor, thank you so much for your presentation. My question is this. I have two parents who are political refugees, and they both suffered very much in the war. By the war, I mean World War II.
Yes.
My dad was in concentration camp for 4 years, and my mom saw a lot of her family murdered in front of her. They migrated to this country and did quite well for themselves, but I saw firsthand what PTSD means. They led a successful life, God bless them. And I have regular blood pressure. I know I stress out a lot. I know I break bones a lot, but I don't know that that has anything to do with it. I don't sleep well. I never have. I was wondering that besides any behavioral issues, their traumas would have been passed on to me.
Well, yes. I think that we understand gradually now that that although the DNA that of our genes doesn't itself change in response to stress, that there are proteins that our body makes that interact with our genes called histones, and those do get modified by our experience, and those modify the expression of our genes. And these are discoveries of the last 10 and 20 years. It's called epigenetics. Okay,
Yes, I've heard of that, but doesn't that take several generations?
Well, it goes, yeah, no, when your parents are under stress, their germ cells, their egg and sperm, are modified in certain ways, and that's transmitted to their children. And these modifications are found in their children, and even, I think, in the grandchildren can have this to a certain extent. I'm not an expert on it, but I think that people do recognize that these life experiences, difficult life experiences, are transmitted for a generation or so to the children and grandchildren. So yes, you could be suffering the consequences. You probably are, to some extent, suffering the consequences of your own parents' suffering.
Thank you, doctor.
It's pretty amazing how it's all connected, right?
Yeah, it is,
Tyrone.
Good morning, Dr. Sterling. How are you?
Good.
Welcome to Race Talk. Eva, I think you made a really good point, because I was thinking about truth to the concept of generational trauma. And just as your grandparents or your parents went through that horrific experience, much of that is equated to the experience of Black folks going through slavery and Jim Crowism and all the other crazy stuff that's occurred over many, many different generations. So thank you for kind of that explanation, because that makes sense to me. John Hope Bryant says, founder of Operation Hope, says he believes that the majority of Black people in this country are clinically depressed because they're dealing with so many different factors that are going on. I think one of them is that culturally, and I grew up in Chicago, we're kind of taught not to show it, So put up the force field, the shield to look like we're cool and we can handle it. And underneath it, there's a whole lot of other stuff that's going on that's tearing us apart. I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but I appreciate the point that you're making, and I want to go back to Dean's point. Is now that you're getting resistance, now maybe you're beginning to not get as much resistance. Maybe some of the more less obscure institutions are recognizing the work that you're doing. But where do we go from there? What's our next steps? How do we actually actualize some of the things, the points that you're making, and connect those dots? Because I got an issue, as Francis mentioned earlier. I got a concern that we got people in DC are like dismissing the whole concept of child care, which will help people take the stress off of them, taking care of their kids, or other elements that wants to be stripped away from this infrastructure bill. So I'm just curious about your thoughts around that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think your point that people can look okay and say, yeah, I'm fine, but your brain, the core of your brain knows what's going on, and you may have a smile on your face, but that doesn't change the fact that you're suffering, and your arteries and your kidneys know that. You can't really hide from that. And I think it also supports my point that the idea of teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, there's a whole bunch of people talking about teaching resilience and grit. They think we need more grit. Well, there's some truth in that. It helps to be able to get knocked down and get up again, but it's not a program. It's not a social program, for God's sake. It's what you need for a social program is to provide people the basic stuff that they need for a healthy life, and that includes, care when they're children, when you're a child, and it includes finding a way to incorporate children at the age of 20 when they need to learn their parents something to do for their lifetime. We could call this tertiary education, and to have them do it without incurring life-crushing debt. So we need support for tertiary education, and that includes. I noticed that Biden's program does include funds for training, for carpentry and plumbing and all kinds of other things, not just a fancy college. And we need. And I think that Biden's program, and certainly the program of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, which I think a lot of it is folded into Biden's big program, is there, that people are recognizing that if there was a will in Congress to do what these 16 nations are doing, we could make things better very quickly. We don't need a socialist revolution. We don't need a gigantic upheaval. We just need to do the simple things that all these other countries are doing, and I think it's possible to keep at it. And when I guess my personal hero, to the extent I don't have that many left, but one of them is John Lewis, who was exactly my age, who got to Jackson in jail 6 days before I did, and I've sort of been following him ever since. And at the end of his life, he said, you just have to keep going, and you have to fight. Sometimes it's the same battle; you have to fight it over again and over again. And so that's we don't need to whine about it. This is just the way it is, and we got to keep at it.
Yeah, thank you. I had Kevin up next, but I don't see him at all. Kevin, if you're still on, I don't see your name anywhere. Please speak up. But let's go to Francis Spector.
Thank you, Dr. Sterling. I'm not surprised also that your work didn't get into medical school curriculum, having gone through medical school and found what was lacking there and still lacking. My other comment is that I just really wish that there was some way to get your voice out there in the political dialogue right now, because I think it is a time when maybe people might be more open to hearing it. And I don't know if that's getting on Oprah or, or having your congressman wave your book around on the floor of the House or whatever it is. But, the case you're making really supports what Biden and the Democratic Party are trying to do. My question is there any data around the comparative hypertension rates among women in the U.S. versus these 16 countries, and women, white women, black women, women of color, whatever, but because women are much more likely to get hypertension after menopause. It's almost universal in our society. Thanks.
Sure. Well, thank you. Let me say, I consider Lane and Eugene are my Oprah. Okay, so let's start from there. As to comparative hypertension, certainly the rates of hypertension among Black women are higher than among white women. And the rates of hypertension rise with age among all segments of the society. This is a function of sort of capitalist, society, that this is what happens. The differences between men and women before and after menopause, I think are complicated, and I don't stay up to date with them. So I can't really quote you chapter and verse about that. Although the National Academy report that I mentioned does include patterns of hypertension broken out by male and female, Black, white, and Hispanic, but I haven't followed it in detail.
Well, I meant the comparison between women in the U.S. versus women in other countries. I'm not sure. Okay.
Yeah, I haven't looked at that, and I haven't tried to study European detailed patterns. But I'm sure it's available, but I just haven't done it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Marcy.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sterling, and thank you, Eugene and Lane. I'm just noticing that a lot of conversations happened about the medical aspects, and I really was hoping to hear you speak about the correlation between all of these stresses on the body, especially for Black people, and how it makes racism more prevalent. I just am noticing that I really want to hear you make those connections if you have that in you, because that feels like what I wanted to hear. That's what I wanted to hear this morning, and I appreciate all your expertise as well.
That's a great question.
I'm not sure I understand. Can you explain a little more? What is your question?
Well, I understood, I thought, when I read your biography before the class or the session, that you would talk about not just the impact on bodies in particular about the stresses, but how that relates to racism. And Adine spoke to the vitriol that Black people experience, and, this underlying, I just am going to call it horror that goes on in the world. And somehow for me, it's not about how can individuals get more healthy. It's about what does culture need to frigging do to make this stop?
Sure.
And it doesn't feel simple to me, and maybe I'm asking a question that doesn't have an answer, but I just wanted to bring that back.
I think it's a fair question. I'm not sure that I am uniquely qualified to answer it, but I think in general, when people are feeling good about themselves and their lives, they're kinder. And when they're feeling terrible, there's a certain number of people that can make themselves feel better by, making other people feel worse. And there's a certain level of, when people are feeling bad, there's a certain level of rage. And you see that in driving. I mean, drive in Boston, I mean, it's a nightmare. If you slow down slightly not to run over a pedestrian, people behind you are honking and giving you the finger and running you off the road and so on. There's a level of rage in the country right now that is lethal. And I point out in my book, and I pointed out in several articles, that the curve that shows rising deaths from mass shootings is superimposed on the deaths from on rising obesity and rising suicide. So I consider mass shootings as an expression of the ultimate in despair. When you're totally despairing, that's what you do. You take a gun and you go out and kill a lot of people until somebody kills you. So yeah, I think to have a country where people were less in despair, they will be less vitriolic, less murderous, less in a rage.
Can I just jump in?
Sure, Colleen. Real
Marcy,
fast.
that is exactly the question that I raised earlier about weathering. And I just put the link to the article from the NIH in the chat for you. So
Thank you.
by
Thank
the
you,
answer.
Colleen. I will check that out.
Can you capture that
Let me
somehow?
see. Yeah. Oh, I'll have to do like this.
There you go.
Okay.
So my beautiful co-host, chatted me, and we brought up, and we're going to talk about this, and we have a little bit of time here. In terms of, and Marcy, that's a great question, right? Because we're talking about, and there was one of the questions, a bullet point. Where did it go? What is the relationship between chronic oppression and disease? And the chronic depression, chronic oppression, when we're speaking about racism, there's that rage and there's a hatred, there's fear and there's joblessness and hopelessness, which is an effect of systemic racism, and how all of these factor in to, and how this is factored into the racism and in the racist system, the systemic racism that is in the country, and of course the world, but we're talking about the country, and so what is it that we can do individually and collectively, because that's where we're going, right? That's where we want to go, is what can we do collectively and individually to bring about a change, right? I don't want to go as far as say to bring about a healing. Let's just start to change. Right. And again, that bullet point, right? What is the relationship between chronic oppression and disease? And we kind of have a sense of what that is, right? Now, what is it that we can do?
Exactly.
Are there any calls to action for the audience, for us today, that we can do to help continue this change? Because I know that there's a change going on. And again, Marcy, thank you so much for that question.
Thank you, Eugene. You nailed what I really, you said what I wanted to say more clearly. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Leah has something to share.
Go ahead, Leah.
Yeah, I just want to, suggest that we just press on the government to keep investing or start investing more in our communities and our people instead of capitalist endeavors and big pharma, and become more of a socialist society. And I thank you, Dr. Sterling, for, stating that your parents were communists. My mother was kind of a socialist and an anthropologist. And socialism has turned into a dirty word, but we need to really get the government to invest in all communities, not just, white people who are making money, all communities. So that's how we can work on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. I would just say, I think when I was younger and, full of fire, I didn't believe much in electoral politics and the Democratic Party and so on. But I have to say that right now, the Democratic Party has a program that really would address a lot of these issues. And what's missing now is enough votes in Congress to really do it. And so I think that we need to defend the voting rights and keep the Republicans from redistricting everything, and really make a fight to have Congress pass legislation that would support communities in retraining, and above all, do something about the climate, because the climate right now is the most threatening thing that we're facing. So, I think I'm still a socialist, but I don't think we need a revolution. We just need to do the basic stuff that's all in those packages that are sitting in Congress. And if we could do that, it wouldn't be, all our problems wouldn't be solved, but it would be a hell of a good start. And we got to make sure that in the next series of elections, we don't, we gain some electoral ground. That is a critical thing. Everybody's got to work, get out the vote, and that's just basic.
And that is the work to do. The work to do is to organize, to bring people in, to have conversations, to absolutely to decide what is important for us in terms of as individuals. What area are you passionate about? Is it health? Is it poverty? Is it education? Is it the vote? And to join your local organization, whatever is out there, whether it's national or local. And from this conversation, certainly, if you didn't know, the next time you hear or read about how unhealthy people of color are, or poor people, or so forth, just know it's not for lack of trying. It is, there are systems that are designed to keep it that way. And that when we operate in the light instead of the dark, we help other people to come to the light as well. And that's what we're all about here. Could talk all day about what to do. And I think we actually know what to do. Keep having conversations with our neighbors, start our book clubs. There were so many books that were put in the chat today. So all these links that were shared, check out the links, read the article, look and see, go to Dr. Sterling's Twitter page, look at his book, see what allostatic load is. This is fascinating stuff. We are so grateful that you are all here asking questions and participating on the level that you are. It's a blessing to have you all here, Dr. Sterling, and the activists that each of you are. Each of you is an amazing activist. And so just keep having these conversations and asking these questions and going to the mat for each other, because we're all in this together. And Eugene and I are available for you. If you need, more support, if you want to have more conversations about this stuff, reach out to us.
Absolutely.
Eugene, I'm going to put Dr. Sterling's information in the chat.
Okay.
Turn it over to you.
And just real fast. Well, okay. I have this urge to say to all of the people who ask questions and everybody who puts stuff in the chat, I want to thank you so very much. When we talk about, your voice matters, this is the part of Race Talk Revolution that I love, hearing the questions and hearing our guests answer the questions and seeing all of the comments and the questions and the statements that go on in the chat. I want to thank you. I can't tell you how grateful I am. I am truly grateful for you guys, how you continue to show up week and week and week in and week out. Let me pull what I need to pull up real fast. So again, I want to say thank you. Let's keep doing what we're doing. When Dr. Sterling said we don't need a revolution, well, maybe what we need is an evolution. Right? Maybe we are becoming evolutionaries, right? To evolve to something greater, something higher. Yes, I love the education. I love the history. Then it's like, okay, now that we have this information, what is mine to do? And now let me find out how I can do that. And that's the question that we each have for ourselves. Yeah. Again,
let me just say, and
thank
go ahead,
you. So
Eugene.
I was going to say, just again, thank you. Lane?
Yeah, and don't forget all the food pantries and all the pop-ups and the things that are happening to help people who don't have. This is the time. It's so easy to find a way to get active now. It's much easier than it's ever been. Next week, please join us. Our guest will be Ordained Centers for Spiritual Living Minister, Reverend D. Jacqueline Edwards. She's going to tell us how to step out of our comfort zone. So we can each do the work that we are being called to do.
Speaking about work.
And don't forget to like our Facebook page and go to our YouTube page and YouTube page.
I wasn't going to say that. I caught that.
But and share the videos. Dr. Sterling, your last word for you, sir.
Well, bless you all. I mean, thank you for listening, and get out there, get out to vote.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Sterling.
Have a great
Thank you,
week.
everyone.
My pleasure. Thanks very much. Yeah. Bye-bye.